And I'm so grateful for those of you from the community who made the time to come, and I hope that you'll indulge me a little bit. There are some parts of my talk that I'm really targeting for the students, and one of the things that I said to them, because we started about an hour ago, we had a session with the students, and so I already know some of them, and I told them we were just going to continue the dialogue in this session, is it's not that much fun to come give talks when you just stand up here and speak out, because then you get to learn a lot about me and I don't get to learn anything about you. And more importantly, I think in places like Little Rock where there is a community, and I learned that today, I'll let you know how I spent my day today, it was really interesting, that there's probably a lot you can learn from each other because you may not know who else is here and you may want to get to know them. So with permission by the folks who run this program, I asked if I could do this a little bit differently and ask for just a little bit of audience conversation for the front part of the talk. And then what I'd like to do actually is keep it fairly brief so that we could spend as much time as you have answering questions, having conversation. I think a lot of the topics I'll cover, I actually don't know all the answers to, and so I would invite some of you who have been doing some of this work in public service much longer than I to offer your thoughts to the students as well. So I actually have to say, when I got the invitation and I saw who else had come, I think I had the same reaction that I know a lot of the speakers have because I watch them on YouTube. They all say, I mean, John King is coming, and he's like a very serious guy. And it was actually pretty easy to pick the topic, which is getting rich in public service. I'm going to share with you tonight my stories, and I don't actually think that they're that special, and they're probably not any more special than your stories, but they're mine, and so it's what I have to offer, and talk to you a little bit about how it was possible that an Egyptian-born in Egypt, religious minority woman ended up here doing the things that I'm doing now and working for an organization that I feel so proud to work for, and I welcome any opportunity to help both inform people about Planned Parenthood. I think we're probably one of the most misunderstood nonprofits in the country, and also hopefully to engage you all in some dialogue to really help a lot of these students who I feel so privileged to have already gotten to know, think about what their careers are going to be like and the contributions that they're going to make. So the way I decided to do this is I'm going to share with you 5 what I think of as very common sense but maybe not totally intuitive tips for how to think about getting rich through public service. And for the first few of them, I'm going to ask for your indulgence in answering some questions with me. So the first is, anybody here who has worked for or been involved in a nonprofit knows that one of the absolute core foundational aspects is a mission. So my question to you is, why do you think nonprofits have a mission statement? Anybody? Yes? And so what I decided is I'll try to repeat some of the answers so everybody can hear it. So you said to give them guiding principles so that they know what to do. Is that right? Great. Anybody else? Why do nonprofits have mission statements? Yep.
I think it's important to be clear to the public so that the public understands. They understand our mission.
Right.
And hopefully they will know what is not our mission.
Right. So, sorry that mic got there a little late. So I think what you said was to make it clear to the public so that when somebody looks at that nonprofit, they understand what it is that guides their work. Yes. Yep. We're gonna let them get the mic to you there. He scared you a little bit with that.
To give staff and volunteers a focus and to encourage a commitment.
Great. So I really like to encourage a commitment. Great. We'll take one. Go ahead. Yep.
Also, to provide an opportunity for the nonprofit to sort of frame the issue in the way that they would like to.
So to frame the issue the way that they would like to. That's great. So for organizations that you really care about, do you feel like you have a good sense of what the mission is, even if you can't state what it is, right? So my first question to you is, why don't we as individuals have mission statements? And that's actually my first tip, is I decided, and I don't really remember how it happened, but it sort of was late one night. I was working at Rice University, and I was actually lucky enough, because I feel like you got a sense from that fabulous introduction, I've just been given more opportunity than somebody should have, and I feel so grateful for it. And so I had a friend say, well, what do you want to, it's the question for all of us at any point in our life, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? And you can't answer it. And so I actually felt that it was critical for me to decide what my own mission statement was going to be. And it's for exactly the reasons that all of you have said, because if you can't explain to other people what is that focus of commitment for you, or what it is that you're going to spend your time and energy on, or how you're going to explain to the public or to other people what you care about, it can be very hard to stay committed to public service, because you don't have that internal clarity that you need to say, this is why I do the stuff that I do on those days when you are not richly compensated for it in a financial way, or you are distressed by the lack of resources that you may experience within an organization or even in government service. And so I had to sit down and decide, well, what was my mission statement going to be for myself? And I think one of the challenges that I have for all of you, and particularly for the students, is if you come up with a mission statement for yourself, a few things are going to happen. One, it's going to be easy to say no to things that seem really appealing to you, that might get you off track from what that mission statement is, because there will be so many, for all of you, opportunities, and I think this is probably true for everybody in the room, all kinds of opportunities that can get you off focus. And if you have enough sense of self to say, I decided long ago that what I care about is X, Y, or Z, it's just easier to say no. And I'm a big fan of recognizing that we don't have to be strong people, we just have to create enough stuff in our life to make us strong, because we may not be able to sort of do it on our own. And so for me, which I'll get to my second tip, was how to create some infrastructure to do that. So I've never shared my mission statement in public, but I figured if I was going to come all the way down here and talk about it, I had to. And tell you a little bit about how that, for me, has kept me focused on a career in public service, when at many points, and I talked with the students earlier, I worked in the private sector and I had a great experience and I learned a lot, and I think that, and I've worked in government and I've worked for nonprofits, really big ones, really small ones, and I think that these are all incredibly rewarding experiences. But at the end of the day, if you're going to really commit your life to what I think of as the very hardest work, what is it that is going to wake you up and remind you, this is why I'm sort of doing it? And for me, I decided that I really wanted to do great things on a grand scale in the service of others. And for me, women and women's issues have really defined most of my work, and I'm happy to talk more about that in a little while, but that if my work wasn't in the service of other people in a very real way on an everyday kind of basis, it wasn't as exciting. And I can think back to the time that I spent at McKinsey. I did joke earlier, although it's true. I did a study for Enron sort of right before McKinsey did a lot of work for Enron, which was incredibly interesting and incredibly enlightening. I didn't know anything about anything. That was it was a HR study, and we did some stuff on pricing for them. But and I remember that at that time I felt like I worked with really smart people. It was such a resource-rich environment. I mean, that was back in the day where there was a lot of food and candy and stuff in the office that I think even for-profits have had to cut back on. And that when I decided to leave Rice, which is where I served, it was in a sort of chief of staff role. The new president of Rice had been named from Columbia Law School. He was the dean there. It was a very interesting choice for Rice, because Rice didn't have a law school, and they had hired a person who had spent their entire career being a dean of a law school, and Rice is in the South, and they had hired a man who had never lived south of Philadelphia and had basically lived in New York and Philadelphia. And Rice is an institution with undergraduates, and they had hired a man who had never really needed to interact with undergrads because he'd spent his entire career in law academia. And one of the students asked how that happened. I was in my office in Chicago working. I clerked for Diane Wood, who is a judge on the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals. She was the first woman to be a tenured faculty member at the University of Chicago Law School, which is a tough place. And I was totally unclear about what I was going to do next. And I got my alumni magazine, and I opened it up, and here was this announcement about this guy from New York City that was going to move to Houston who had never done anything but be a law school dean. And I thought, well, I got to learn more about that. So I sent him a note, and I said, I don't know what your plans are, but I've been in law schools up in the Northeast, and I've spent a ton of time at Rice and maintained a lot of the relationships, and I would love to see if I could help you. And part of what motivated me to do that was that I had a clear sense in my mission statement that I'm a big believer that we need big institutions in our society that are high functioning. Those include universities. I have tremendous respect for people who work in higher education. It's hard work. We need these big nonprofits, and that we need to find a way to make sure that the big institutions that we need are working really well. Because one of the things that I talked about earlier today with some of you is government. We sort of have a pact where social service agencies are being asked to take on more and more. And they have to be really high functioning, and they have to be able to deliver, because that gap is growing in terms of the expectations of what nonprofits are supposed to be doing in order to make up for the safety net. So because I'd had a mission statement that I had processed and thought about and wrote down, it was really easy to say this is something that sort of might make sense for me. So that's the first tip. Tip number 1. Try to write yourself a mission statement. It's actually not that intuitive to do at any point in your life, but I think certainly for the students. Otherwise, staying in public service can be really hard. There will be many points along the way where other things will seem much easier to do. So my second question is, we know that nonprofits have boards of directors, right? They have governance volunteers, and boards, I'm sure for those of you in nonprofit management and those of you on boards and those of you who are staff who work with boards, they have any number of functions. So we're probably not going to go through all of them, but what are one of the or two of the main reasons that we have boards for nonprofit organizations? To raise money. I need another reason. To set policy. Anybody else? Yep. To hire and fire the executive. Okay. Fiscal oversight. Yes. To get expertise. Okay, those are all correct. But one of the other reasons that I think, so we'll see if anybody's head nods when I say this, one of the other reasons that organizations have boards is to ensure that that organization stays true to its mission at a very fundamental level, right? Because you hire staff, and I'm a big believer in governance and why it's really important that you have volunteer leadership in your organization. So you hire staff, and maybe they get a little off track, or they decide they want to do something else, or they do something that kind of in the big picture is not the mission of the organization. Would you agree that that's an important role that boards play, sort of outside of the... So tip number 2 is to get yourself a board of directors, which I have started talking about this concept in the last year or so with a lot of sort of management types and folks who do a lot of leadership training and leadership development training. And the concept of creating a board of directors for yourself is very similar to the idea of creating a mission statement for yourself, which is you're creating some external accountability that you're going to stay consistent to the path that you've set for yourself and what your mission is. There's no, and a few organizations are beginning to experiment with this in sort of leadership development programs that I'm aware of, and there's really like no magic to it. So I decided 2 years ago that I would do that, and I thought really hard, because one of the things I'll talk about in a bit is how important it is to have mentors and think about the people that you're learning from and how to really get the most out of mentoring relationships. But this is something a little bit different. This is asking people to understand what your mission statement is and to hold you accountable for sticking with it, so that if you go off track or decide to do something else, you have to go explain yourself to your board just as you would in a nonprofit organization. And maybe you have a really good explanation and they totally buy into it. Obviously, they can't say, I mean, they could say no, but there's a little bit of fiction that you'll have to sort of recognize here. And so I felt like this was a place to use people differently than I traditionally used mentors. And I have mentors in many different categories. And I actually feel like there are mentors that you learn from that are much older than you and have a lot of experience. I also feel like, especially in today's times, you can learn a lot from people your own age, and you can learn a lot from people who've had similar experiences. And so I have recently, as of 2 years ago, put a board of directors together. And I did that precisely because staying in public service is really hard, and it's hard in my estimation because you're going to have a lot of opportunities potentially to do things that sort of feel easier, or get off boards that feel like they're a lot of work, or there's not enough resources to go around, or we can't raise the money that the board was supposed to raise in order to move the mission of the organization forward. And it's a very quick accountability check that I put in place, and I explain what I'm doing and why I'm doing it and what my plans are for the next year. It's not really that time consuming. And it's something that I think that for those of you particularly who articulating what you want to do is going to be important, because you have to try to explain that to prospective employers. You have to try to explain that as you're applying to potentially go to graduate school. If you have to explain that because you may be thinking about a switch in careers, the more you practice explaining what you want to do and why you want to do it and have people really help you get that right, the more successful that you're going to be in all of those transitions, whether it's trying to get into a grad school or trying to get into medical school or trying to get a job for the first time or deciding you really want to make a switch out of the career that you're kind of in. So that's tip number 2. And I think that it's something that once you think about it, it kind of makes sense, but it's not something that anybody would have probably thought to tell you to do. So for all of you, I think it's an interesting concept, but especially for the students, it's something that you could do even with each other. What I chose to do is actually put 2 people on my board, that's what I call it, who are closer to my own work experience in terms of working in nonprofits, because I needed some people who understood why I was there and what I was doing. I picked 2 people who are in the private sector, who I think of as really being big thinkers and who I think are very sort of intellectual in their approach to what they do. One of them actually is the global CEO of Honeywell, which has proven really interesting because Planned Parenthood and Honeywell don't have a lot of overlap, but he has provided tremendous insight into the work that I do and has been very helpful there. So that's the second tip. So tip number 3 is to be obsessed, and I can't actually think of a better verb, to be obsessed with trying to find people to work with that you think are better than you and smarter than you. And that is always, it's actually not always intuitive that that's what we seek in the workplace and that's what we want to go after, but it's not fun to know more than everybody else, because then you stop learning. And if you stop learning, you either become ineffective in the work that you do, or you get bored and you become disengaged. And I think that what has been very rewarding for me in my time at Planned Parenthood is the opportunity to get to learn from so many people who do work outside of my own areas of expertise. And in just a few minutes, I'm going to talk more about Planned Parenthood, what we do, the work that we do, and give you some examples of that. But I actually think that for a lot of us, it feels good to be the smartest person in the room. And I think that the problem with that is that you might not stick around for as long as if you feel like I am still learning and I am learning from people that are so different than me. And I want to caveat that by saying that going to the fanciest schools does not make you the smartest person in the room. And I have a lot of friends who have gone to fancy schools who cannot get anything done. And that, in fact, what I have discovered has been more true is that the people that you're going to learn the most from typically are the people you least expected. And in an organization where there's 93 years of history and there are folks who have been there for many decades, you are never, ever going to move an organization forward without at least understanding its history, even if it's a history you want to change or a history you disagree with or a history that got the place in trouble, you have to take the time to learn from and understand. Some of the smartest people in that organization may not be the ones that you intuitively thought about, or the people that you go to first, or they may be people in positions that you think of are way lower than your executive director job or your CFO job or your whatever. And I think that the challenges that nonprofits have, and there are many, is how to focus on people development in a time of really constrained resources, and how to make sure that you're investing in your people and growing them and moving them along their career trajectories. One of the studies that came out about 2 years ago from an organization called the Bridgespan Group, and it's a nonprofit-focused arm of one of the consultancies. So they did a projection about how many new nonprofit leaders are going to be needed between now and like 2016 or so. So they looked at things like retirement based on sort of the cohort of people running nonprofits and executive management roles. They looked at the proliferation of new nonprofits, because there are many new ones that are coming. And they estimated, even though it's an eye-whopping number and I couldn't believe it, but it's online, you can look at it, they estimated that we're going to need something like 640,000 people to assume leadership positions in nonprofits in this coming decade. And that, in their estimation, was a crisis in terms of how do you attract, without compensation, again, getting rich in the traditional way, how are you going to attract a lot of these folks, because we need more than we're going to be able to keep up with, and particularly in the retirement era. You asked me that, right? In the retirement era, how to think about what that new crop is going to look like and how they're going to be prepared for tomorrow's challenges. And so the reason that I really want to emphasize that and talk about it both from a nonprofit management perspective, but particularly from Planned Parenthood's perspective, is that this is an organization that was started in many communities many years ago by committed volunteers who in most cases really were focused on the teen pregnancy crisis in that community. And we are now having to build the next generation of this movement, and we have to find ways of attracting young women who may be very different or have different thoughts or different backgrounds, different ideas, different races, different everything, and figuring out how to keep a dinosaur organization. There's a categorization of nonprofits where the sort of big old ones are called dinosaurs and the little new ones are called poodles, and so they have this whole thing about dinosaurs and poodles, so I'm constantly reminded I work at a dinosaur. How to keep them relevant for this next generation, and how to keep the issues relevant, but more importantly, how to actually attract those folks to want to come volunteer and work. And so it's something that certainly in my role, and and I have an operational role, that's what I do on a day-to-day basis, think about how we're going to attract, retain, and certainly recruit these folks, because 640,000 is a lot, and I don't actually know how to solve that problem. So that's the third. So tip number 4 is to not believe everything that you hear about nonprofits. So what do I mean by that? There was some myth busting that we were doing earlier, and I think talking about Planned Parenthood is the easiest myth busting that I typically can do. So having worked in a for-profit consultancy and having worked in a for-profit entity that did some manufacturing, at the end of the day, in its simplest form, the difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit is how they're categorized in the IRS tax code. There's tax exempt and there's not tax exempt. Now, there's all kinds of other things that we can say are different about nonprofits and for-profits, but kind of at the end of the day. So do they both care about having really smart people do good work and deliver results and have high performance and focus on impact? They absolutely do. I think, however, what that is all moving towards is the kind of question that having a mission statement sort of helps you focus on. So I enjoyed my work at McKinsey very much. I enjoyed working for really large companies. I learned a lot. I never felt satisfied. And that was a decision that I had to make for me, and I did a lot of volunteer work while I was there for some of the local nonprofits, doing strategy consulting and helping them, but it just wasn't enough for me. And I think that hopefully when we get into the Q&A, that's kind of a conversation we can have, because I think that there were a lot of folks who I mentioned that earlier today when I was visiting with the students. The other thing that I would say on this point is that finding the people who are going to inspire you to think as big as you can, whether you know them, and a lot of times they could be people in your own life or people you don't know. I've had 3 or 4 of those people that I just want to tell you a little bit about. So as I said to you, my family came here from Egypt. I grew up in Round Rock, Texas, which people have heard about. It was really this small town with a big public high school. I went to public school my whole life. And then Dell came and headquartered, and now people know Round Rock more because Dell Computers is there. And I was really privileged to participate in the American Legion Auxiliaries Girls State Program. I don't know, okay, some heads are nodding. It's a wonderful program, really that for me was a great opportunity to realize how much I valued being an American and really focused on public service. And so you get to go and you run for these offices. So they have towns and counties and states. And so I ran for governor, which I don't want to be governor of Texas, but I was for like a week in high school. And so I had an opportunity to meet Ann Richards because at the time Ann was the governor of Texas, and she was very engaged in the Girls State program. And when the elections were all done, we all got to drive to the Capitol, meet our counterparts, if you will. So here's this, like, I'm so nervous I get to meet Ann Richards, and my mom's crying, and everybody, they don't even know what I'm doing there. And I decided that I wanted to talk to Ann about 2 of the bills that I had authored when I was in the Girls State legislature. And so she really liked that I talked to her about substantive legislation. And so she made a comment about it in her speech, and then she asked me if I'd come intern in the office. I mean, I like wrote it was an intern job. And she essentially decided that I was going to be somebody she was going to care about in her life, even though I didn't see her that much and we didn't interact that much. And Ann Richards has been the reason that almost all of my opportunities have come to me. And it was because at that moment I decided that I wanted to take advantage of talking to somebody who had really big ideas about my ideas and sort of how big they could be. After I left Girls State, I went to Washington. If you're familiar with this program, you know that it happens at the state level for high school juniors, and then there's a Girls Nation program where 2 or 3 2 people from each state go, and then you do the same thing sort of at the national level. So I went to Girls Nation. I didn't have any aspirations to run for anything, but I thought I'd go and sort of see who was there and check it out. And there's only 2 offices you can run for at Girls Nation. There's president and vice president, and then everybody else is a senator. So I, about 2 days in, thought, well, there's some smart people here, but, I'm just as good as anybody else. Maybe I'll want to run, see what happens. And so my counselor came to my room one of the evenings and said that because I wasn't born in the United States, I wouldn't be qualified to run for president of Girls Nation. Now, I heard her and I thought about it, and I said, I really understand that, but the Constitution also requires that you have to be 35 to run for president, and nobody at Girls Nation's 35 either. And so it was my first example in trying to meet people halfway, or at least try to understand where they were coming from. And we talked a lot earlier today about common ground, which we're going to talk about in terms of people just having really different. So I said, can you help me understand this? Because as far as I can tell, this is like a high school educational program, and nobody's 35, and it wasn't my fault that I was born somewhere else, and I want to try to participate as fully as possible. And they just, they weren't going to have any of it. And so I had to decide at that moment, what I was going to do. And what I decided was I probably wasn't going to change anything for myself, because if I did, I'd create a big stink and ruin this whole week for all these other people and probably for myself. And it probably wasn't worth that. So just like in the state houses, you're allowed to write legislation about whatever. So I decided what I would do was I would write legislation to amend the Girls Nation Constitution so that in future years, young women who, and given the demographics of our country, this is just, you may have a different view about the real Constitution. I think it may eventually happen, but if people can commit that they are 100% devoted to this country, which I am, none of us pick where we're born. That's not a decision we have any input in. And so I amended the Girls Nation Constitution, and they changed it, and I think 3 years later, there was a young woman who was a naturalized citizen, which was what I was at the time, who became the president of Girls Nation. And I only tell you that whole story to say that Ann Richards gave me enough sort of sense of possibility that I felt like something like that was possible. And I don't think you need to have famous people as mentors. I don't think you need to have people who are in big fancy jobs, but you have to have people who inspire you to think sort of bigger and broader than yourself, and who make you think that doing something hard is possible, because that, I think, was what I took from that. And that really moves me to my last point, which is you have to create a community of support if you're going to work on tough issues. And in my biography that you heard about, like, Planned Parenthood was never anywhere on the spectrum of anything I was going to do. And not because I actually didn't care about the issues. In fact, every place that I've been, I've started the women's group, I've focused on women's issues, these were all kind of core beliefs, but they never led me to Planned Parenthood. So 2 things happened. One is that 5 years later, I met Ann Richards. We didn't really communicate, I mean, we didn't like hang out, but I met her for lunch, and this was about a year before she died. And one of the things that's so tragic to me is that probably in 5 years, if I come and speak on this stage again, there's going to be a lot of people in the audience who won't know who Ann Richards is anymore, which is really, so anything I can do to keep her memory alive, I feel committed to doing. So we sat down, and she looked at me and said, "I think you should move to New York." Now, at the time, I was in Houston, I was working at Rice, I was really so happy. I think that, as I said, universities are the most complex nonprofits, and they have a big social mission, but they have to run like a business, and I was learning a lot. So I looked at Ann and I said, well, I really don't want to move to New York. I mean, I didn't even know what to say. So she sort of dropped it, and then a little while later she said, I really think you should think about moving to New York. And I said, well, if you tell me what you're talking about, then, so she didn't say anything else. We sort of left lunch, and then a week later she said, well, I'd like to call you about being in Dallas on January 8th. This was December 23rd. It was like the 2 days before Christmas. So here I am. I've not talked to Ann Richards in 5 years, and the next thing I know, she's calling me on my cell phone, which was, and so I answered, and she said, I'd like you to be in Dallas on January 8th, and she didn't say why. Well, it's Ann Richards, like, you're going to be in Dallas on January 8th, and you don't know. So I went to the office the next day. I said, I got to be in, I don't know why, but I need to be gone. And it turns out that January 8th was the day that Planned Parenthood Board of Directors was going to name her oldest daughter, Cecile Richards, to be the president of Planned Parenthood. And Ann felt like whatever she could do to convince me that this is something I had to think about. And for her, I said, I'm not interested in changing jobs in our sort of career planning. And I went and met with Cecile. And those of you who know Cecile know she is one of the most dynamic, charismatic, powerful leaders of women and the women's movement in America today. And I didn't really know that at the time. So I went and visited with her, and I said, I don't really know what I can do to be helpful to you. The only thing I can tell you is when I joined David Lebron at Rice University, he had a big, ambitious change agenda, which is really hard. If you're in these big organizations, how do you drive change? How do you have an agenda that like moves lots of people, and you don't control them, and you can't tell them what to do, and they have their own agendas? And I said to her, the only thing I feel like I can help you with is how do we like put a process in place that helps you hear from people so that you can then have an agenda that they feel like they've been heard, even if it's going a different direction, which is what we had done at Rice. And so we did that the first month that she was there. And I did this as a volunteer. I was still in my other job. And I just knew in the absolutely you don't get rich volunteering category that it was an opportunity, and I needed to jump on it, and I would figure out later how I was going to make up the time or do anything else. And so we put a process in place to ask Planned Parenthood staff and volunteers all across the country what they wanted to keep, what they wanted to change, how did they feel the organization continued to be relevant, how were we becoming irrelevant. And then I spent 2 weeks holed up in this little room reading all this stuff, having to figure out sort of what it meant and put something together for the board of directors. And so with that, let me just tell you a little bit about Planned Parenthood, what I got out of that. There's a few people here at this front table that I at least want to acknowledge, and then open it up hopefully for some conversation and dialogue. So that fabulous introduction, Planned Parenthood was founded 93 years ago. It is the largest reproductive healthcare organization in America. We see about 3 million people in our clinics. We see about another million teens through teen programs. We see between 15 and 18 million people online that come visit our website. We're set up to have local affiliates because community contact is the most important way to be successful with any kind of work. So we now have 90 affiliates. They run 880 health centers that serve all 50 states. The set of services that we provide is 40% at a national level, so it varies a little bit by each affiliate, but at the national level, 40% of what we do is well woman exams, contraception dispensing, women who come in to get their annual exam or their pap smear or the like. 30% of what we do is testing and treatment for sexually transmitted diseases or infections. So we see a lot of male clients for that work as well. 20% of what we do is some form of cancer screening or cancer prevention. So we do about 1 million mammograms a year. We do screening for HPV. We do vaccinations, Gardasil, for the HPV vaccine. About 10% of what we do is any range of other women's health services. Some of our affiliates provide prenatal care. Some of them provide other male-oriented services. And then about 3% of what we do nationally is abortion, which is what most people who are not familiar with the range of services equate the organization with doing. I will say abortion is a safe legal medical procedure, and we provide it proudly, so it's not to shy away from it. It is to say that it is a piece of a much broader set of services that typically, if you haven't been to a Planned Parenthood, and according to the statistics over many years, 1 in 4 women in her lifetime goes to Planned Parenthood. So usually most of the women I talk to are familiar with the range of services because they've either come or they've had a family member come or somebody else come. And so the direct care that we do is really critical because we fill a safety net that in many communities there may not be anybody else providing. 75% of the clients that we see are at or below 150% of the federal poverty level, so it's very much a low-income population. We provide a range of services that have been growing in the last few years for men as well, and teens come primarily for educational services, but then direct services as well. But you can't provide direct services without an advocacy environment and a climate, both public policy and even elected officials, that allows that to continue, particularly when you're doing things that, for reasons that are tragic to me, or really continue to be very controversial in our country. And so in addition to the direct service provision, which really happens at the local level by the affiliates, we do a lot of advocacy work, and most of it, I would say almost all of it, is really focused on prevention-oriented policies and recognizing that there are so many common sense solutions that we ought to be able to get people on the same page about and talk about. We have done a lot of work in Washington, D.C. around sex education funding and trying to both restore that at the state level as well as at the federal level. And we are trying to work with the White House, particularly around a task force that the president has put together around sort of common sense solutions to reduce the need for abortion. And to borrow a line from my boss, who is quite eloquent, I really am a sort of a sad second to be here. If you could hear Cecile, she's going to be on Hardball tonight. They just told me that, so if you get home and watch it, she'll be on. Is that if you are committed to wanting the abortion rate in this country to go down, and if you want to reduce the need for abortions, then one of the best things you can do is actually link arms with Planned Parenthood, because that's what we're trying to do as well. And I think that today was really such a humbling reminder for me that I can talk about this and I can sit in my office in New York and I can go visit, but the people who do this work on the ground are really the heroes. And so I'm really pleased tonight that there are so many people here at this front table who have come from the Planned Parenthood of Little Rock, volunteers, and Hot Springs. But what is yours called, just so I get the name right? Choice, thank you. And some volunteers from the Choice organization in Hot Springs. And I'm sure that this requires force of character, and I also believe that for many of them, and maybe we'll have a chance to have a discussion later, a lifetime of service and a lifetime of commitment, particularly, unfortunately, to issues that there's still a lot of work to be done, can be very hard. I want to end by borrowing your line, if I could, which is, if it's anything that has happened in the last month between this Half the Sky is this book that Nicholas Kristof and his wife Cheryl Wudunn have authored about, and Nick Kristof is a journalist for the New York Times, and he and his wife have won a Pulitzer Prize writing together about the Tiananmen Square incident in China. And so they've written this incredible book in which they really sort of conclude that the way to fix all of the world's problems, including war, is to empower and educate women, and that will, in and of itself, transform our society and transform our world. Or the Shriver Report, which was just recently issued by the Center for American Progress, that really talks about a world in which women are now becoming the majority in the labor force, and a recognition that women are the next, this is the next generation. And I personally believe that the work that we do at Planned Parenthood is so essential and so critical to making all of that possible for this next generation of women. So with that, I'll stop talking, and thank you very much for making the time to be here, and I hope, to the extent there's time remaining, we can have some Q&A, or if you even just want to make comments, I'd be happy to hear them as well. Thanks, Bob.
If you could raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you so that we can all hear you.
Okay, and Bob gave me a great tour today of the library.
We have Bob and Bill. Anyone have any questions?
Yep.
I just wanted to make a comment. My name is Kim Caldwell. I'm a Clinton School student here, and thank you for invoking Ann Richards. I was an elementary school student in Texas when Ann was governor, and I'll never forget thinking that I could be something special because we had a girl governor. Mm-hmm. And thank you also to the Clinton School for having her in the video next door, and just so personally touched by your story, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, I think one of the things that we have to do, not just as women, but as men too, we've got to keep electing women in public service and in public office. There have been so many stories like that of the women governors in the South. North Carolina elected a woman, and I think that these are people who make you feel like possibilities are real. Thank you for sharing that.
Dewi?
I'm Dewi, I'm from Indonesia. I'm a student here. Thank you for very inspiring speech and session before. I have a question about fundraising. Mm-hmm. I understand you do a very tremendous work, like in very tough issues like abortion and stuff like that. And I believe it's not a very easy work to do. So I'm so touched. My question is, I understand that you said that you got some funds also from the government, and I believe also maybe you got some funds from companies. So how do you make sure that you can still do what you're doing? Because I believe sometimes there's some donors or some people that they give the money to you, but they get some hidden agenda that maybe can influence that what you're doing is become not really what you're doing, because you also have to answer the donors' interest, I think. That's my question. Thank you.
That's a great question. So one of the things that I pay a lot of attention to in my job is just fundraising trends in the nonprofit sector and what's happening. I'll tell you a little bit about that generally, and then I'll answer your question specifically to Planned Parenthood. I think one of the biggest challenges, and I know some of your prior speakers actually who you've had come talk about sort of nonprofit philanthropy have talked about this, is that everybody very rightly wants to give nonprofits money for program and for services. They want to know that the dollar they're giving you is a dollar that's helping somebody. And maybe it's because of the unique position that I sit in my organization. We can't deliver those services if we don't have the infrastructure of the organization to do that well. And there is nothing attractive about asking people to pay for overhead, because who wants to do that? But I have become lately, I'm a fan of trying to explain that we used to have philanthropic trends where particularly foundations, but even I think individuals who gave large sums understood that giving general operating support to an organization was really important because it gave that organization the maximum amount of flexibility to use those monies as they needed for their highest priority items. And what has tended to happen, and this has been a little bit true in universities as well, is somebody has like a thing that they really want to do, and they want to give you a lot of money to do that thing, and you have to because that's the agreement you make with the donors. The good news is I think there's a lot of regulations around how nonprofits are audited to use monies in the interest of the donor, so it's really hard to sort of hide it or do something with it that you're not supposed to do. But so for example, there was a case both at Princeton and Yale where they were given $20 million gifts to put like a program that didn't make any sense for them in place. And you have got to be a courageous nonprofit leader to walk away from $20 million for sure. But I think increasingly people are realizing, like, if I can't make that work for the organization, or if I can't fund the infrastructure to deliver on those services, it's not going to sort of work. And so it has been so hard in this environment in particular not to go sort of chasing where the money is. And so I think that some of the work that's happening in think tanks and even here to really try to talk about how do we maximize the dollars that we're spending in the philanthropic community so that you can let organizations become really strong and healthy, because if I have a team of really strong, healthy people, that additional dollar I can make it $2 worth of services and service provision and do the things that you want to do. So I think that that's been something I've been particularly worried about. I will say Planned Parenthood National, we don't get any government funding. The only government funding is at the state and local level if those affiliates are typically in welcoming states. I'll be candid, I think it's pretty much in progressive states where that's the case, and in some states where particularly the political environment is much more hostile, we actually qualify for federal or state funds that we are explicitly denied because they don't want to give it to Planned Parenthood, even though we would qualify for the services that we provide to get it. And so I think that that has been a bigger challenge. I will say it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next 4 years and potentially 8 years with a new president in terms of federal funding that will be available, probably not to us as an organization, but writ large to these issues. And I met with several students here who are working in this community on teen pregnancy programs or basketball programs, trying to help young men really be as safe as possible. And I think to the extent that federal funds can be used for that, the social sector, I feel like we're kind of maxed out where we are, and we're trying to find new and creative ways of capturing the imagination of sort of the very biggest donors and the very biggest foundations, but also helping them understand that they have to give to us in a way that really allows us to deliver on the mission and sort of do it in the very best way. And then the final thing that I'll say is for a lot of organizations that are funded by foundations, foundations give a percentage of their assets on a 3-year rolling basis. So the hit that their assets took when the economy tanked last year is going to impact their giving levels until 2012 at least. And so even though for some of us the stock market looks like it's come back, there are so many places where it is going to take a long time for those giving levels to get back to where they were before the market decline that we saw last year.
Anyone else?
Questions?
Yep.
Thank you. I'm wondering how you as an organization plan to, do you have a goal or do you have an approach in order to change the misapprehension about the kind of services that you provide that has percolated into the political spectrum these days?
Yeah. So the students have to forgive me because we talked about this earlier. Before I got to Planned Parenthood as a staff member, even though I sort of recognize these issues, I would say that all the time, like, why can't they just talk about what they really do. And now that I'm in it, I'm like, we do that every day. But how are we going to get it out into the public perception? So there's two things I would say. One, I think the political environment is a big piece of this for us, and how we do work to organize advocacy and how we do work to focus on, through our Action Fund, which is a C4 organization, to work on elections. The second piece that I think is really a challenge is if I had a huge amount of resources that I could use for like a big branding campaign so that everybody in a community knew that Planned Parenthood does X, Y, or Z. I don't think I could use it for that if I needed to use it to deliver services in that community at that time. And I think one of these difficult choices that we have as an organization is there is tremendous need that we have to put our resources towards as we fight through what you rightly point out, which is in some parts of the country. Oddly enough, it's not so much in Washington, D.C. or in places where we're trying to shape opinion leaders and trying to shape policymakers' viewpoints. I think at the state level, it is mixed and it's a struggle. And so how do you find the resources to really prioritize a kind of branding or a kind of marketing campaign? My own observation is that in many communities, a lot of people already know what Planned Parenthood does, but we're not breaking through. And I'd welcome, there may be comments afterwards from the folks who are here and involved in the local organization, how to break through at the political level so that we are supported. The other thing I would also say is I think some people don't want to listen. So even if they know, I don't know that that's necessarily going to change their mind. And I really haven't figured out a solution to that one.